I call the subcommittee to order. And today we will mark up I recognize myself 3 minutes for an opening statement. Today we will mark up the Food and Drug Administration Reauthorization Act of 2017. This is an important milestone in the work to reauthorize the Food and Drug Administration user fee programs. The Food and Drug Administration began holding public meetings on these agreements in 2015, and Congress received the Food and Drug Administration and industry's proposed commitment letters in January of this year. This subcommittee has held 4 legislative hearings on the substance of this bill, as well as several of the amendments that we will consider today. Today's markup is just the latest step in nearly 2 years by the biopharmaceutical and medical device industry, the Food and Drug Administration, and Congress. This bill is bipartisan. This bill is bicameral. It is a priority to complete this work and reauthorize the user fee programs in a timely manner. In each of our hearings, we have heard about the tremendous success of the user fee programs in expanding access to affordable medications, supporting biomedical innovation, and maintaining high standards at the Food and Drug Administration for safety, efficacy, and quality. The Food and Drug Administration Reauthorization Act will build on these successes as well as the achievements in the 21st Century Cures Bill and ensure that the FDA has the resources necessary to get medical treatments and cures to patients and healthcare providers as quickly as possible. I certainly want to thank Chairman Walden and Ranking Member Green, Ranking Member Pallone, and all of the members of this subcommittee for working in concert to improve the substance of this bill, and certainly we all look forward to sending it for presidential signature in short order. In addition to the Food and Drug Administration Reauthorization Act, we will also be considering 2 important public health bills. Representative Bilirakis has an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1222. This bill will take several important steps to save and improve the lives of infants and adults affected by congenital heart disease. And finally, I would like to speak in support of H.R. 2410, the Sickle Cell Disease Research, Surveillance, Prevention, and Treatment Act of 2017. This bill that was introduced by Representative Davis and myself would further our commitment to helping those with sickle cell disease by increasing our commitment to research, surveillance, prevention, and treatment through federal collaboration with local and community-based entities. Having cared for patients with sickle cell disease as a physician at Parkland Hospital, I've seen firsthand the devastating effects that this can have on people, patients, and their families. This bill provides an important step forward in ensuring that we have the resources to better understand this disease and to maintain access to the services for those affected by sickle cell disease. I'd like to thank again all of the members of the subcommittee. I know we've all put in a tremendous amount of work on this product. I look forward to advancing it to the full committee. I yield back my time and recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Green of Texas. 3 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is the kind of markup we like. All 3 of our bills we've worked on, of course, the FDA reauthorization, much more. We had a number of hearings, but let me first talk about H.R. 1222, the Congenital Heart Futures Reauthorization Act. It was introduced by our colleague on our committee, Congressman Bilirakis and Congressman Schiff from California. Is really important for reauthorization, and I'm glad our subcommittee is doing these reauthorizations to make sure we have everything lined up so we can request funding for the programs through the appropriations process. Our next bill is 2410, the Sickle Cell Disease Research, Surveillance, Prevention, and Treatment Act, both by our chair of our Health Subcommittee, Congressman Burgess, and Congressman Davis. This is very important for the research and the authorize this particular research program so we can get money from the appropriations process. Now, on the FDA reauthorization, we have a package of 4 user fee agreements that reauthorize key FDA capabilities to review and evaluate medical products on behalf of the American people. It's critical that these programs be reauthorized in a timely manner. Failure to do so will halt clinical trials, grind research to a halt, and to put new therapy pipeline in jeopardy. We have had hearings on the underlying agreement, and they have what I would call a love fest. Much progress has been made since the first user fee agreement was made in 1992. I'm pleased that we're advancing these 4 negotiated products today. One of the issues, the over-counter monograph reform and establishing a user fee program for OTCs is a critically important issue, and I hope to continue working with my colleagues and in our committee to advance these critical issues. We also are considering several amendments which are bipartisan in nature and will improve our nation's overall health. I look forward to learning more about these amendments from members today and moving forward. And I'll yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair yields to the gentleman from Michigan. 2 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Those who know me know that I've got a long record of supporting innovation when it comes to research and development on new drugs and devices. That's why I was proud to sponsor the 21st Century Cure Acts with my colleague Diana DeGette. This bill broke down the barriers for research and development, putting a greater focus on patient-centered care, and gave billions of dollars in resources to the NIH. When President Obama signed our bill into law in December last year, it marked a truly great victory for patients and researchers across the country. Now that it's law, we've got to make sure that the FDA is able to handle new breakthrough treatments in a timely and predictable fashion, all while still maintaining the highest levels of patient safety. That's why these user fee agreements are so important. My district in Michigan has literally thousands of jobs that are impacted by the legislation, whether it be on the drug side with Pfizer, plant in Portage, Michigan, or the device side at Stryker's headquarters and manufacturing facilities in Kalamazoo, or the generic side at Perigo and Allegan. Passing this legislation is vital to these good-paying local jobs and prevents the FDA from laying off literally 70% of the folks that they have working on approvals. It's important that we do this expeditiously. I yield the balance of my time to Dr. Murphy.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan. I want to comment on, I know we're going through this, and I thank the chairman for moving this, these bills through committee. On one of them, I want to comment, we are, Mr. Costello of Pennsylvania will be offering an amendment when this goes to full committee on some of the issues involving medical devices, with regard to third-party persons who service them, and making sure the FDA is working with them to certify them, and so that we end up with quality services throughout that, and that this is something that we're fully aware of. So I do want members to know that that amendment will be coming forth, and it'll be a good one for us to review and support at that time. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone of New Jersey. 3 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're considering 3 bipartisan bills that will reauthorize CDC's congenital heart disease programs, HRSA's sickle cell disease prevention and treatment demonstration program, and FDA's medical product user fee program. H.R. 2430, the Food and Drug Administration Reauthorization Act, would reauthorize FDA's user fee programs in the areas of prescription and generic drugs, biosimilars, and medical devices. This bill is the product of considerable discussion and negotiation between FDA, industry, and additional stakeholders, and also incorporates the bipartisan bicameral work of this committee and the Senate. Swift passage of the user fee reauthorization package will ensure that FDA layoffs will not occur and that the medical product review process will continue uninterrupted, ensuring patient access to the medical treatments they need. I am disappointed that the Trump administration is pushing at the last hour to reopen negotiations on the user fee reauthorizations in order to withhold federal government support for the critical work that is at the heart of FDA's public health mission. The Trump administration should seriously reconsider any reopening of these negotiations. Instead, we should move forward with this bipartisan bill that will allow the FDA to meet its mission of ensuring the medical products that patients and American families use are safe and effective. And I hope that all of my colleagues will reject this proposal and continue the process to reauthorize the user fee programs as agreed to by the FDA and industry. Mr. Chairman, I did want to raise, however, the issue of drug pricing in the time that I have left. Prescription drug prices are rising at an alarming rate, and the problem is widespread. Annual drug spending in the United States is estimated to reach more than $500 billion by 2018, and in 2014, spending grew by 12%, faster than any year since 2002. And this increase is having a real impact on American families, with 1 out of 5 Americans aged 19 to 64 unable to afford the cost of their prescriptions. Throughout the country, and even from our president, there is bipartisan support for action to lower the cost of prescription drugs and make treatments more affordable for patients and their families. Yet despite this commitment from the president, our committee has yet to take a serious look at what can be done to address the high costs of prescription drugs. So I want to call on the president and my colleagues on the committee to work with us to have a serious policy discussion on how we can work together to find policies that will truly help to reduce drug prices, and I think that work should begin immediately. So I urge the chairman to hold a hearing on this issue and to begin a process where we can work together in a bipartisan manner, as we are today, to learn more about what can be done to make prescription drugs affordable for patients and their families. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Shimkus, 2 minutes for an opening statement. No. Does anyone on the majority side seek time for an opening statement? The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Billrock, is recognized for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you for holding today's markup so we can take these positive steps forward to help patients. I'm very glad that we are considering the Congenital Heart Futures Reauthorization Act, a bill I introduced to improve the lives of the nearly 40,000 babies born each year with congenital heart defect. The bill reauthorizes CDC's surveillance program of congenital heart defects and ensures important NIH research continues. I'm also pleased the committee is moving a bill I co-sponsored, the Sickle Cell Disease Research, Surveillance, Prevention, and Treatment Act. Sickle cell disease is known for its prevalence in the African American community, but it also impacts the Greek community and other Mediterranean communities. Finally, it's great news that the committee is moving the FDA user fee bill. This will reauthorize the user fee program and make reforms to the FDA to bring about greater efficiency. I'm also proud that the language I worked on with Representative Schrader to lower drug costs will be part of the reauthorized user fee program, and I truly believe this reauthorization will improve the FDA. However, I want to take a moment to talk about the OPEN Act, a bipartisan bill that I introduced with my colleague G.K. Butterfield. OPEN Act would provide an incentive for companies to get mainstream drugs approved for a rare disease. It has the support of over 150 rare disease groups and passed the House in a bipartisan fashion within the 21st Century Cures Act. When 95% of rare diseases have no FDA-approved treatments, we can't sit by and do nothing. I hope that as we move forward with FDA user fees, we can revisit this important legislation and try to help the 30 million Americans suffering from a rare disease. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California. 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased that our committee is working together in a bipartisan manner to reauthorize the user fee agreements that help to fund the FDA. The FDA ensures that drugs and devices in the U.S. are safe and effective, and we cannot take that important role for granted. However, I must say that FDA could approve all the safe and effective treatments in the world, but it wouldn't matter if no one could afford them. If people don't have access to health insurance that covers necessary treatments like prescription drugs, chemotherapy, or pacemakers, then the existence of those treatments doesn't help them. I'm extremely concerned by the bill that passed in the House. Instead of taking coverage and essential health benefits away and charging people with pre-existing conditions more, we should build on the work that we did in the ACA to make coverage affordable by examining policies in this committee that would keep the cost of prescription drugs down. We need to ensure that we're encouraging innovation and development of new drugs and treatments, especially for diseases that we don't know enough about, like those of the brain, like Alzheimer's and mental illness. But at the same time, we need to ensure that when those drugs and treatments come out the other end, they're not prohibitively expensive. I'm discouraged that our committee has yet to have a hearing to discuss this topic in earnest and bring in witnesses to help shed light on the complicated process that results in final drug prices. There are many ideas out there to fix the problems, but there's no single silver bullet. So we really need to dig in and work across the healthcare industry to find solutions so that patients are not stuck with the bill. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden. 3 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, to my colleagues. Today we mark up 3 bills. 2 are public health bills that received hearings last Congress and garnered strong bipartisan support. The other bill is the Food and Drug Administration Reauthorization Act of 2017, which I introduced earlier this week, along with Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Burgess, and Ranking Member Green. This legislation is really critically important for patients, drug and device manufacturers, and the entire health care sector. We've all read about medical innovations that once seemed like wishful thinking coming to fruition now. And at a recent hearing, the FDA told us that more advancements are on the horizon, but not without the legislation we will consider today. Now that 21st Century Cures has become law, the FDA Reauthorization Act is more important than ever, and we must continue to build on these successes and improvements for patients, delivering hope for new treatments and cures. The FDA Reauthorization Act would reauthorize the agency's critically important drug and medical device user fee programs, making improvements to each of them based on lengthy deliberations involving the FDA, industry, patient groups, and other stakeholders. These agreements were submitted to Congress in January pursuant to a process laid out in statute, and we've been working on a bipartisan, bicameral basis since then to translate these important agreements into legislative language, which was first circulated several weeks ago. Under the leadership of Dr. Burgess, the Health Subcommittee has held multiple hearings for members to better understand how the updated and improved user fee programs will provide FDA with the tools it needs to ensure that patients have timely access to safe and effective new drugs and devices, including generics, biosimilars, and others, which will increase competition and bring lower-cost alternatives to the marketplace. This subcommittee also examined additional medical device provisions, some of which have been updated and are before us today as amendments. I fully support the agreements that are included in this legislation. Along with Chairman Alexander, we remain committed to a timely reauthorization. And let me be clear, if we do not have this bill to the President's desk in July, not only will thousands of FDA employees be seeking new employment, but also desperately needed treatments and cures will not reach patients. We cannot and we will not let that happen. I do want to take a moment to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for working on thoughtful ways to improve this legislation. I understand there will be several bipartisan amendments offered today and that there are a host of additional issues that will continue to be discussed and hopefully resolved by our full committee markup. I appreciate everyone's commitment to better this important bill. In addition to the FDA Reauthorization Act, we're also considering 2 public health bills that address 2 relatively common but life-threatening diseases. H.R. 2410, the Sickle Cell Disease Research, Surveillance, Prevention, and Treatment Act of 2017, sponsored by Representative Danny Davis and Chairman Burgess, reauthorizes the Sickle Cell Disease Treatment Demonstration Program. Sickle cell disease is red blood cell disorder that causes lifelong illness. It's the single most common inherited blood disorder in the United States and still has no cure. Through research, surveillance, prevention, treatment, and enhanced collaboration with community-based organizations, this bill will lead to better interventions and eventually a cure to this debilitating disease. Finally, we're considering an amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1222, the Congenital Heart Failures Reauthorization Act of 2017, by Representative Bilirakis. By improving the CDC's congenital heart disease surveillance system and enhancing biomedical research with respect to congenital heart disease, this legislation will help us better understand and improve long-term outcomes for children and adults with this condition. So I look forward to advancing these important bills and would like to thank the entire committee for your dedication to identifying important ways to help our patients, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for 2 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The bills on the agenda today are very positive bipartisan steps, especially the reauthorization of the way we fund new drug development through user fees. It's very important that we get that done. But I wanted to note that here we are halfway through the year already. This Health Subcommittee has had 9 markups and hearings, but not one on tackling the skyrocketing cost of prescription drugs. And we know there is overwhelming bipartisan support from our neighbors back home that their representatives here in Washington take action to lower prescription drug costs. In fact, some polls, if you go out and do a little research, say that it is the #1 issue for our neighbors back home, for policymakers in the White House to act on. But you really don't need polls if you listen when you go back home. I'm hearing it, and I know my colleagues are as well. Recent price hikes, such as the overnight 5,500% increase in the cost of the life-saving drug Daraprim, or the 500% increase in the cost of EpiPen, and the $84,000 price tag for the hepatitis C drug Sovaldi have exposed the injustice in America's drug pricing system. Mr. Chairman, I note that the Senate Health Committee intends to hold a hearing. They said, we'll schedule a hearing in the near future on drug spending in the U.S., including what we currently spend on drugs, what types of drugs, and what the projections are for drug spending in the future. This committee should not be derelict. We should take this on, and we can tap the expertise from folks all across this country that understand it and begin to draft policies to address the issue. And that's my hope and my recommendation to the committee. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Does anyone else on the majority side seek recognition? Seeing none, Dr. Schrader, recognized for 2 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Well, it's been clear that there are a number of things we've disagreed on so far in the committee. I think that it's nice here today and hopefully in the future to celebrate some of the bipartisan things we do agree on. This FDA user fee legislation that we have in front of us here is just such an opportunity. Thanks to bipartisan work, especially by our committee staff and our personal alleged staff, today we'll approve the FDA Authorization Act, which will ensure timely review of new drug and biologic applications. It'll streamline medical device and biosimilar regulations, and it'll speed up the review of generic drug applications, all saving consumers money by ensuring a more smooth regulatory process. I plan to offer a bipartisan amendment with my colleague Gus Bilrakis, which will further enhance the generic drug program to spur additional competition in the marketplace and help bring prescription drug costs under control, where bad actors have jacked up these prices dramatically. I'll speak more about my amendment when I offer it later, but I wanted to take time to thank my colleague, Mr. Bilrakis, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Burgess, Ranking Member Green for committing to a nice bipartisan process that has created some genuinely very good policy. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and the gentleman does yield back. Does anyone on the majority side seek time for an opening statement? Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this subcommittee markup. These are good bipartisan bills that are before us today, and I support them. And I thank the authors for the work that they've done on them. I think that the FDA user fee agreements are really critically important programs because they've provided essential resources to the agency. A, and B, these resources have not only improved the approval processes for medical devices, biosimilars, prescription drugs, and generic drugs, but they have also moved along the time frames for approval, which is something that has been a bipartisan priority for this committee and I think our full committee. So I think that it's essential that we pass this legislation. It is must pass, and I'm very happy that not only the negotiations moved forward, but that it is before us. I want to thank my colleague, Representative Lance, who has worked with me on another issue. These user fees are 100% industry-paid, private sector dollars. And wherever anyone is on sequestration, those dollars should not be held hostage. And so our legislation exempts the user fees from sequestration. And I think that that's very important. I hope that we can get rid of sequestration, but wherever that goes, these user fees should not be a part of it. So I thank Representative Lance for that. I'd also like to just raise one issue, and that is the biosimilar user fee agreement. I'm concerned, and I know that we don't want to fool around with the language, but I do want to raise the flag that the issuance for revised or final guidance being pushed back until as late as early 2020 is really upsetting to me, to put it mildly. We've been at this since the ACA passed, and it just keeps being dragged out, dragged out, dragged out. I think that we can do much better, but I just wanted to raise the flag on it since I was the House author of that legislation, and I think full implementation is really important to move along the whole issue of biosimilars. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Does any member on the majority side seek recognition? Seeing none, the chair recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado. 2 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing up these three important bipartisan bills. I want to commend the committee for looking at the FDA Reauthorization Act because, as Mr. Upton said, it builds directly on the 21st Century Cures Bill that we worked in such a yeoman's way on this committee last Congress, and it's really exciting to start to see the hard work begin to come to life. Some of the things that that it builds on from cures are patient-focused drug development, use of real-world evidence, and biomarker qualification. So I know this is going to be a really important endeavor. I just want to mention one other issue that's a bipartisan issue that we're hoping to work on this spring and summer. Mr. Ladd, Mr. Green, and myself have been collaborating for the last year on another bill that will deliver badly needed reforms to the approval process for over-the-counter medicines. This bill would modernize how FDA reviews over-the-counter medicines, a process that has not been updated since the 1970s. The current system simply has not kept pace with science, innovation, and growth in this over-the-counter market. Most importantly, the bill takes common sense steps that will help the FDA prevent and address safety issues rapidly and efficiently, which will be a major benefit for virtually all of our constituents and their families. I wanted to raise this because I think it's really another great promise for improving Americans' health, and I hope as we continue to work to reform FDA review over-the-counter medicines, we can also talk about this bill. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky. 2 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are several aspects of this legislation that I fully support. This bill takes important steps to increase the number of generics on the market. For example, it will allow the Food and Drug Administration to hire over 1,000 new full-time employees to review generic drug applications. This bill also will provide additional resources for the approval of biosimilars, which have the potential of saving between $44 and $250 billion over 10 years compared to biologics. Currently, the FDA has only approved 4 biosimilars, while the European Union has approved 20. So it's critical that we work to get more biosimilars on the market. However, this bill falls short by doing nothing to truly reduce the price of prescription drugs. A recent poll found that 6 in 10 Americans believe lowering the price of prescription drugs should be a, quote, top priority, unquote, for Congress and President Trump. The president has even said he believes we need to lower drug prices, and yet here we are passing another bill that helps the pharmaceutical industry without a single reform to lower the price of drugs. The drug pricing crisis cannot be attributed to a single bad actor or a few blockbuster drugs. A recent study done by the AARP found that 97% of widely used brand name drugs had a price increase that exceeded inflation in 2015. And this crisis cannot be solved by simply bringing more generics to market. We need a comprehensive solution that increases transparency, lowers prices for patients and public insurance programs, and ensures that every American can have access to the drugs that they need at an affordable price. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Seeing no other members seeking to give an opening statement, that concludes opening statements. The chair at this point would call up H.R. 1222 and ask the clerk to report.
H.R. 1222, to amend the Public Health Service Act to coordinate federal congenital heart disease research efforts and to improve public education and awareness of congenital heart disease and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there other amendments? For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1222, offered by Mr. Bilirakis of Florida.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment in the nature of a substitute makes minor technical changes based on feedback from HHS. The Congenital Heart Futures Reauthorization Act will ensure a continued investment in surveillance research to assess the lifelong needs of individuals with congenital heart defects, or CHD. These surveillance efforts will help improve our understanding of CHD across the lifespan from birth to adulthood. This research will help us learn more about demographic factors such as age, race, gender, or ethnicity. In addition, the legislation emphasizes the need for continued biomedical research at the National Institute of Health on the diagnosis, treatment, and prevention of CHD. NIH will further research into the causes of congenital heart defects, including genetic causes, and study long-term outcomes in individuals with CHD of all ages. NIH may study data collected over a lifetime to identify effective treatments and outcomes and identify barriers to lifelong care for individuals with congenital heart defects. I was proud to be one of the original authors of this bill when it first was introduced in 2009 with my colleague, Congressman Zach Space, a former member of this committee. And I'm proud to be able to champion this bipartisan reauthorization bill with my colleague, Congressman Adam Schiff. This bill has the strong support of the Adult Congenital Heart Association, the Pediatric Congenital Heart Association, the American College of Cardiology, the American Society of Echocardiography, the Society of Thoracic Surgeons, the American Heart Association, and the National Down Syndrome Society, and others as well. CHD is the most common birth defect and the leading cause of birth defect-related infant mortality. It is true public health. It's a true public health issue, and as late night show host Jimmy Kimmel noted just a few weeks ago, it does not discriminate by race, gender, or socioeconomic status. The road ahead may be scary and uncertain for any parent with a newborn who has CHD, but this bill helps give hope to those coping with the diagnosis. Nearly 1 in 100 babies are born with CHD, and more than 5% will not live to see their first birthday. Even for those who receive successful intervention, it is not a cure. Children and adults born with CHD require ongoing, costly, specialized cardiac care and face a lifelong risk of permanent disability and premature death. As a result, healthcare utilization among the CHD population is significantly higher than the general population. It is estimated that compared to their peers, the medical costs for individuals with congenital heart defects are 10 to 20 times greater. Hospitalization costs for pediatric patients alone total more than $5.6 billion each year, which is 15% of all hospitalization costs for patients 20 years of age and younger. Despite its prevalence and significance, there are still gaps in research and standards of care for CHD patients. Previous congressional support of CDC's National Center on Birth Defects and Developmental Disabilities has yielded an increased understanding of the public health burden of this condition. But for the sake of the estimated 40,000 babies who will be born in the next year with CHD, there's more work to be done. I ask for the adoption of this amendment in the nature of a substitute and for the swift passage of this bill. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Chair, thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Other discussion on the amendment? The chair recognizes or for what purpose does the gentlelady from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank Representative Bill Rackus for his work and leadership on this legislation. And I speak not just as a fellow colleague, but as a mom. As most of you know, my son, our oldest, our son Cole, was born with that extra 21st chromosome, Down syndrome. And one of the things about Down syndrome is that 50% of the kids that are diagnosed with Down syndrome are also born with the hole in their heart, the congenital heart defect, and they immediately have to get surgery. And this legislation is really important, and excited to support it to provide more research, more surveillance, and hopefully lead to better treatments and long-term outcomes for patients. I can tell you, because of the work that's been done, those with Down syndrome are living longer than ever. You think about just it wasn't that long ago, their life expectancy would be 25 to 30 years, and now it's 50, 60 years, and it's because of this kind of an effort that we're seeing better outcomes and longer lives. Thank you, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks, the gentlelady. The gentlelady yields back. Is there any other discussion of the amendment? Seeing none, the vote then occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 1222 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Chair then calls up H.R. 2410 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 2410, to amend the Public Health Service Act to reauthorize a sickle cell disease prevention and treatment demonstration program and to provide for sickle cell disease research, surveillance, prevention, and treatment.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open to amendment at any point, so ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? Are there any amendments to the bill? Chair will recognize himself to strike the last word to speak on the bill. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. H.R. 2410, the Sickle Cell Disease Research, Surveillance, Prevention, and Treatment Act of 2017, has been introduced by Representative Davis of Illinois and myself. Sickle cell anemia is an inherited disease in which red blood cells are unable to properly carry oxygen throughout the body. The condition causes severe episodes of pain and fatigue, can lead to damage of the eyes and other organs. This important legislation would reauthorize the Sickle Cell Disease Treatment Demonstration Program and enhance the Secretary's ability to conduct surveillance on the epidemiology of sickle cell disease and implement public health initiatives, identify and evaluate sickle cell disease prevention and treatment strategies. This bill will move us one step closer to improving the quality of care and symptom management for those affected, and I urge support and yield back the balance of my time. Is there other members seeking recognition on H.R. 2410? Seeing none, the question then occurs on the bill 2410. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 2410 to the full committee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. And those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. The chair calls up H.R. 2430 and asks the clerk to report.
H.R. 2430, to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to revise and extend the user fee programs for prescription drugs, medical devices, generic drugs, and biosimilar biological products, and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill will be open for amendment at any point. So ordered. Are there any bipartisan amendments to the bill? For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to strike the last word and speak in support of the bill.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the package of user fee agreements before us today represents nearly 2 years of work between the FDA, industry, and other stakeholders. These agreements not only provide FDA with the resources to continue the agency's critical public health work, but it also provides the medical product industry with certainty and stability in the review process. The resources provided help the agency to hire the necessary scientists, investigators, and review staff, as well as undertake new initiatives such as incorporating the patient perspective into the medical product development and review process, supporting new tools to modernize clinical trials, and improving regulatory science. Now, these agreements certainly do not address every issue that I know members of this committee and other outside stakeholders would like. For example, I mentioned earlier about the drug pricing issue. The vast majority of Republicans and Democratic voters all agree that an important health care priority for the new president and Congress is making prescription drugs affordable for those that need them, and the government needs to take action to lower drug prices. However, it's critical that we move the FDA reauthorization swiftly, as we've heard that nearly 5,000 FDA employees would be in danger of being laid off if we don't reauthorize the user fee programs on time. But I just wanted to touch briefly on some of the key elements of the user fee agreements before us. With regard to PDUFA, the first of the medical product user fee programs, it has been incredibly successful at bringing reviews of new drug applications down by more than half and providing patient access to treatments more quickly, often before any other country. PDUFA 6 will maintain current review timetables while also modernizing the user fee structure. And the agreement also commits to hiring an additional 230 employees and builds on the work of 21st Century Cures by investing resources in the development of biomarkers, collection of real-world evidence, and supporting innovative clinical trial designs. Like PDUFA, MEDUFA has been successful in bringing medical devices to patients sooner, bringing review times down overall, resulting in the approval of novel new devices sooner. In fact, just last year, CDRH approved the highest number of novel devices in the history of the MEDUFA program, approving 91 novel medical devices. MEDUFA 4 will build on these successes by advancing the use of the patient perspective in the risk-benefit assessment of medical devices, establishing a system called the NEST to utilize real-world data for pre-market approval of new indications and post-market safety monitoring, and improving pre-submission communications with sponsors. All of these actions will help to increase the consistency, efficiency, and effectiveness of medical device review. We're also considering today the reauthorization of two of our newer user fee programs, the generic drug user fee program and the biosimilar user fee program. Both of these programs strive to expedite access to high-quality, lower-cost drugs for American families, and the user fees were meant to help address the interest from sponsors in timely review of their applications. Under GDUFA 1, FDA worked to address the backlog of generic applications and has committed moving forward in GDUFA 2 to meeting a 10-month review timetable for traditional applications. GDUFA 2 also works to help bring generics to market as soon as they're able through improving communications between FDA and sponsors throughout the review process and instituting early communications to aid sponsors in the creation of complex generic drug products. These steps will help to move FDA and sponsors closer towards first cycle approval. And BZUFA 2, Bazoofa, wow. Also builds on the lessons learned under Bazoofa 1, ensuring that there is sufficient resources and qualified staff to respond to the growing interest in biosimilar development, improving meeting opportunities in order to provide sponsors with meaningful feedback, and instituting a similar review model to PDUFA, which will allow for greater communications during the review process. Now, I just wanted to note, however, that I was disappointed to receive a letter this week from Secretary Price indicating that this administration would like to recalibrate the user fee agreements. The user fee agreements before us were carefully negotiated by FDA and industry and represent nearly 2 years of deliberations. These are very real repercussions associated. There are very real repercussions associated with not passing the reauthorization of these user fee agreements on time. And the reviews of novel medical devices and drugs will come to a halt. Thousands of employees would be laid off, and patient access to treatments and medical innovation would be threatened. Very real consequences are on the line. And so again, I urge my colleagues to reject this last-minute plea from the administration. This is a strong bipartisan user fee reauthorization and one that deserves our support. And I look forward to continue our work on all of the user fee agreements to ensure they're signed into law as soon as possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair would recognize himself for the purposes of striking the last word and recognize myself for 5 minutes. As the committee knows, as the subcommittee knows, this bipartisan bill updates and reauthorize the Food and Drug Administration user fee programs for prescription drugs, for medical devices, for generic drugs, and biosimilar biological products. The Food and Drug Administration Reauthorization Act of 2017 will ensure that the FDA has the tools they need to deliver safe and effective products to patients more quickly. I think I agree with every member of the subcommittee today that it is important that we do our work and advance this bill out of subcommittee today. I yield back the balance of my time and ask for any bipartisan amendments.
I'd like to strike the last word.
For what purposes, the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Like to strike the last word, Mr.
Gentleman is
Chairman.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm very supportive of the whole UFA package. This is probably a unique opportunity to do some add-ons as we've agreed to in the past, and I think they have to be bipartisan, and I think they have to have passed that test of policy writers that will be accepted and move. So in that spirit, I want to mention something that I hope we can get some buy-in and work on stuff we've talked about in other Congresses on the antimicrobial or the superbug issue, which is a calamity that could occur, and how do we get responsive antibiotic drugs and remedies to the market as soon as possible. It's something I've worked with Ranking Member Green on, and I would hope that we could add this to the package in between the markup here and the markup to the full committee. I know just last week, doctors at the University of Illinois at Chicago rang the alarm bells and said Illinois is ground zero for the superbug cases in the United States, and global health experts are sounding the alarm. You can go through the stories, and the whole issue is we need to be prepared to administer antibiotics in a large amount as quickly as possible. So the drug companies are being asked to be prepared to prepare something that we hope we never have to use. So that's kind of the business debate, is that in this case, they have to be able to respond quickly and prepare something and have something on the shelf that we hope we never have to use. So in that vein, I would hope that we can, as in past Congresses, get a chance to work with colleagues like I have with Mr. Green before, and add this to the package. I don't think it's controversial in the past, and in fact, FDA has been pretty supportive of this, and Janice Woodcock and her testimony. So with that, I yield to my friend from Texas.
Thank my colleague for yielding, and thank him for partnering with us over the years. Superbugs remain a major issue. 23,000 Americans die of infections from drug-resistant bacteria for which we have no cure. The pipeline is dry and the threat is grave. Last user fee reauthorization. We had the GAIN Act. In the 21st Century Cures, we had an ADAPT to address some of the regulatory barriers to the antibiotic development. We need robust incentives to address this broken market. Absent new treatments, surgery, neonatal care, chemotherapy, and other medical innovations will be too dangerous to perform. I want to thank my colleague, Congressman Shimkus, for his partnership and leadership on this, and I hope the committee maintains its commitment to addressing the antibiotic resistance crisis, because it is a crisis in our country. And I look forward to working with you, if not on this bill, on future legislation. And thank you for the time.
And I yield back.
Thanks, the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek to strike the last word?
I do.
For what purposes, the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would simply like to make a few comments on a piece of legislation we discussed at the recent user fee legislative hearing that is absent from today's markup. As you know, Reps Costello and Peters have introduced H.R. 2118, the Medical Device Servicing Safety and Accountability Act. This bill would ensure consistency and regulation for proper servicing of medical devices. It is my understanding that the committee is continuing to work the bill with sponsors and stakeholders to improve upon the language. H.R. 2118 is a practical solution that will protect patients who not only rely on the safety of the medical devices, but also on their effectiveness and reliability. I support its consideration and inclusion when the user fee package comes before the full committee in the near future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, thanks the gentleman. Are there any bipartisan, the bill is open for amendment at any, beg your pardon. For what purpose, the gentlelady from California seek
I wanted to
recognition?
move to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to express again my support for the registration of third-party servicers who make repairs to medical devices. Although it wasn't discussed today, I'm supportive of these efforts to ensure consistency in regulation for proper servicing of medical devices. It's a very important area. There's currently no oversight of service activities performed by third parties and no registration of those who service medical devices. Third-party servicers are currently not even required to register with the FDA, creating, I think, an enormous blind spot in the very important medical device industry. So I think that this is a serious patient safety issue. There are many third-party servicers who operate safely and effectively, as do the devices they service. But without regulation, patients are the ones who really stand to lose the most. The medical device servicing industry has changed significantly since the issue of device servicing was last seriously considered by the FDA almost 20 years ago. So this hasn't been examined for almost 2 decades. I think that the proposal that we have that's currently being finalized is going to bring transparency and consistency to FDA's oversight of third-party medical device service companies without adding an undue burden to the companies. So I think it's a common-sense approach that will improve patient safety and proper maintenance of life-saving medical technology, and that the proposal, I think, is a practical solution that's going to protect patients who not only rely on the safety of medical device technologies, but also, very importantly, on their effectiveness and reliability. So I look forward to discussing the proposal that both Representatives Costello and Peters will raise during our full committee markup, but I did want to make some comments on it today. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Other members seeking recognition, bipartisan amendments. For what purposes the gentleman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Kennedy.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Green for holding this markup today and for all of your work on a user-fee agreement. Passing robust user-fee legislation must be a priority, and I'm pleased to see a bipartisan draft before us today. I cannot understate the importance of reliable FDA when it comes to many life sciences businesses that call Massachusetts home and in my district as well. I'd also like to thank Representative Blackburn and her staff for all the work that they have done to help those individuals with hearing loss get easier access to affordable and safe care. The amendment that I'm offering this morning would create a category of over-the-counter hearing aids at the FDA. Currently, Medicare does not cover the cost of hearing aids, which can exceed $2,000 per ear. Additionally, according to AARP, roughly 40% of the over 60 population experiences hearing loss, yet only about 20% of those affected use a hearing aid. Affordability and accessibility are some of the biggest barriers to getting hearing aids. That's why Congresswoman Blackburn and I introduced the bipartisan legislation and why it already has support of consumers, doctors, industry, and AARP. With innovation taking place in our districts and increased competition among businesses, we can improve the quality of hearing aids and protect patients while simultaneously lowering costs. According to the FDA, over-the-counter hearing aids will provide, quote, a more flexible approach to hearing aid regulation, which has the potential to deliver new, innovative, and lower-cost products to millions of consumers while ensuring proper safeguards that will protect patients, end quote. With the FDA's assurance of safety and efficacy, with clear labeling, and with the proper volume output limits, these devices will be able to safely address hearing loss for millions of Americans who simply forego care in the current market. As the process to reauthorize the user fee bill continues in the coming days and weeks, I look forward to addressing any outstanding concerns and to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to perfect the language. I encourage everyone to support this amendment, and Mr. Chairman, I have a piece that I'd like to submit for the record of FDA technical assistance, if I may, and I would yield my time to whoever would like it.
Without objection, this order will be added to the record.
Happily yield to Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I am so pleased to join Mr. Kennedy in this amendment and in making this something that is available for our constituents. I think it's important to note that under current regulations dating back to the 70s, only 20% of the Americans who could benefit from hearing aids actually end up getting one. And as we heard in the subcommittee hearing earlier this month, the primary reason for the low rate of utilization and adoption includes the high cost of hearing aids, which is over $4,000 per pair, and it is a stigma. And then you have the cost and then difficulty accessing it. Now, Mr. Kennedy mentioned different people that have supported making this change. You have PCAST, you have the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine have recommended that the time has come for consumers to be able to access hearing aid products over the counter for treatment of mild and moderate hearing loss. The bill addresses each of the key reasons identified by experts for the low utilization of hearing aids. An over-the-counter hearing aid regulated as safe and effective by the FDA would cost hundreds of dollars, not thousands of dollars. By allowing those with mild and moderate hearing loss to directly access and self-fit hearing aids, we will encourage many of those who just wouldn't participate in today's hearing aid system to seek and to get help. I am really grateful that we have so many audiologists who support this bill, including the Academy of Doctors of Audiology. And as Mr. Kennedy mentioned, the list of supporters of this legislation is growing. It includes the Consumer Technology Association, the American Association of Retired Persons, among many others, and I encourage our colleagues to support this amendment. And I yield back.
Chair, thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Yield back the balance of the time. The Chair would recognize himself for 5 minutes for the purpose of striking the last word and observe that untreated hearing loss is not a benign condition. Even mild to moderate impairments in hearing can result in impairments in the quality of life. FDA regulations have not kept pace with the rapid advancement in hearing aid technologies. so access to hearing aids has remained a significant barrier to millions of Americans from whom they would benefit. This amendment before us today is based on H.R. 1652, authored by Mr. Kennedy and Ms. Blackburn. By directing the Food and Drug Administration to establish a category of over-the-counter hearing aids, Americans with mild to moderate hearing loss will benefit from life-changing and in some cases life-saving hearing technologies at competitive prices. At a hearing of this subcommittee several weeks ago, Dr. Jeffrey Shuren from the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Frank Lynn, a Johns Hopkins ear, nose, and throat physician, and a leading expert on hearing loss, unequivocally agreed with the conclusions of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology and the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, an NIH-funded, peer-reviewed, placebo-controlled study that a category of OTC hearing aids would be safe and effective for adults with mild to moderate hearing loss. Dr. Shuren and Dr. Lynn also testified that there is no scientific nor any medical basis to justify medical screening as a condition of purchasing an over-the-counter hearing aid, since the likelihood of detecting a serious treatable condition is minute, but the burden of such a requirement could be a significant barrier to access for consumers. Furthermore, the legislation does require the Food and Drug Administration to establish safe output limits and safety labeling to protect children and those with other serious ear conditions. I urge my colleagues to support me, to join me in supporting this bipartisan, bicameral effort to greatly improve the lives of Americans who are hearing impaired. And I will yield back the balance of my time. Does any other member seek recognition? For what purposes, the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move this right the last word.
The lady's recognized for 5 minutes.
As the co-leader with my colleague on the other side of the aisle, Representative Guthrie, of the Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Authorization Bill to ensure babies are screened for hearing loss, I am very interested in ensuring that infants and children with hearing loss are given every opportunity to learn, grow, and thrive. And on the other end of the spectrum, I am also concerned about the impact of and availability of hearing aids for older Americans. I know that barriers currently exist for seniors to obtain hearing aids, including a sometimes significant cost barrier, which the Representative Kennedy Blackburn amendment before us intends to address. I am hopeful that if the FDA moves forward to create an over-the-counter market for hearing aids, we can all work together to ensure there are no unintended negative consequences for consumers. For example, we should require that the label on over-the-counter hearing aids indicates that the product is not meant for use in children. We should also ensure that there is adequate surveillance, evaluation, and communication as the over-the-counter market is created, so that we have a feedback loop to catch any problems. I do look forward to continuing to work with my colleagues as this bill advances. I believe this is really a wonderful step forward. Thank you, and I yield to anyone who wishes. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Other discussion of the amendment? If there's no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further bipartisan amendments to the bill?
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose the gentleman from Indiana seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R.
Clerk will suspend. The chair failed to mention that the amendment was agreed to. It will be reported. Now we will proceed with the gentleman from Indiana's reading of the reporting of the gentleman from Indiana's amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2430, offered by Mr. Bouchon.
The reading of the amendment is dispensed with. And the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment contains the text of H.R. 1736 with FDA technical assistance changes. It seeks to improve the quality and efficiency of the inspection process for medical technology manufacturers by applying a transparent and risk-based approach to the frequency and nature of device establishment inspections, allowing FDA to focus its resources where they are needed most and reducing the regulatory burden on establishments with a strong history of compliance. This amendment also improves the communications process between the FDA and manufacturers to provide more consistency and certainty for device establishments. I'd like to thank Ms. Brooks, Mr. Butterfield, and Mr. Peters for their leadership on this amendment. And I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I look forward to moving this legislation through the subcommittee, the committee, and to the House floor, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The chair, for what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm proud today to offer this amendment along with my colleague, Mr. Bouchon. It is a common sense bipartisan amendment that will improve patient safety by ensuring that the FDA is making the best use of its resources. And it will provide some much needed consistency and transparency in the routine inspections process. I've heard from many companies in my state and from other states that there are vast discrepancies of inspections between facilities across districts in the United States, as well as between facilities of the same company within the U.S. and outside of the U.S. These discrepancies result in facilities being held to different standards simply because of where they are located, and to Mr. Bouchon and myself and others, this makes no sense. Of course, we want FDA to conduct rigorous inspections, and this amendment does not change their authority to do that. But we also want FDA to be consistent in their approach, and the heart of this amendment addresses those issues. This amendment, Mr. Chairman, will provide some much-needed consistency and transparency into the routine inspections process by establishing some rules of the road for the FDA inspectors as they inspect device facilities, like regular communications between FDA inspectors and the facility both before, during, and after the inspection. As I said before, nothing in this bill takes away or limits FDA's ability to inspect. Instead, it directs FDA to focus its inspection resources on the more significant risk to public health and establishes these important process improvements that I just mentioned. We've heard from the FDA at 2 hearings now that this is a good policy and that they agree that this proposal puts forward needed changes to complement what FDA is already doing in this space. And so I'm proud to work with my colleagues from both sides of the aisle on this amendment. I urge my colleagues to join with me in voting for it. Mr. Chairman, I thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes himself for purpose of striking the last word.
I move to strike the last word.
Chair, for what purpose does the gentlelady from Indiana seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I too would like to voice my support for the amendment offered by my colleague from Indiana, Dr. Bouchon. Consistency is the word of the day with this bill, and this amendment's a good faith effort by Congress, the FDA, and the medical device industry to bring much needed consistency to the inspections process. Why is a standardized inspections process important? Let me give you an example. Following an inspection, companies must respond to the FDA within 15 days with a full remediation plan. However, the FDA is under no obligation to respond to this plan. Therefore, companies are left in the dark, sometimes until after the next inspection. They don't know whether or not the changes they're making meet the FDA's standards and won't until their next inspection. This amendment is about making sure that the FDA responds in a timely way to companies' remediation plans so companies can move forward with their fixes. This amendment ensures the FDA inspectors and companies have clear parameters for communications before, during, and after inspections and provides much-needed guidance for both parties involved. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Bouchon, Congressman Peters, Congressman Butterfield, and the Energy and Commerce staff for their hard work. Urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Further discussion on the amendment. If there's no further discussion, the vote will occur on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments on the bill? Let me, the chair will recognize himself for the purpose of offering amendment. I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment to H.R. 2430 offered by Mr. Burgess.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. This amendment is identical to a bill introduced by Representatives Lance, Dingell, Green, and myself, H.R. 2376, the Drug Diversion and Counterfeit Crackdown Act of 2017. This bill is narrowly tailored to close certain gaps and inconsistencies in existing law that are intended to keep counterfeit and diverted drugs out of our nation's healthcare system. Under current law, the penalties for illegally diverting drugs into the United States that were manufactured abroad and intended for foreign markets are significantly less than if the drugs were initially manufactured in the United States. Further, the penalties for counterfeiting are much lower than for diversion. There is no public health or patient safety rationale for these arbitrary distinctions. The Drug Diversion and Counterfeit Crackdown Act of 2017 would make two minor changes to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. First, it would provide the same penalties for diverting drugs made outside the United States and intended for a foreign market as the penalties that currently exist for diverting drugs made inside the United States and intended for a foreign market. Second, it would also increase the penalties for counterfeiting to match the current penalties for diversion. Gaps in the penalty structure of the law threaten our drug supply chain, creating potential harm to public health by failing to appropriately penalize the sale or distribution of counterfeit and diverted drugs. This amendment will make minor additions to the statute to close these loopholes, protecting consumers. And I would like to yield to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Green, for his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding to me. This amendment strengthens the drug supply chain security by aligning the penalties for counterfeit and diverted drugs. It simply clarifies that prescription drugs manufactured and labeled for non-U.S. markets shall not be diverted into the U.S. unless legally imported by the individuals or in a shortage situation, and increases the penalties for counterfeit drugs. Patient safety is tantamount, and this amendment is a step towards better protection. This committee took huge strides when we enacted the track and trace legislation. Our amendment builds on this success to further protect and strengthen our drug supply chain security. And thank you for yielding to me. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and the chair yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'm proud to join you, Chairman Burgess and Mr. Green, in support of this amendment that will crack down on counterfeit drugs that enter the United States. Too many American patients are given counterfeit and adulterated drugs disguised as reputable brands, and this amendment will increase the penalties for counterfeiters. Counterfeit drugs are coming into the United States, and Americans are falling victim to knockoffs that had infiltrated the U.S. supply chain. These counterfeit drugs may contain harmful ingredients and incorrect or expired active ingredients. Criminals take the risk knowing that the punishment is a minor offense in our criminal code. That needs to change. We need to strengthen the system and protect patients. To reach the market, a new drug must proceed through the vigorous vetting process at the FDA. Once approved, these therapies are then marketed in the United States. Counterfeiters mimic these drugs with medications often manufactured in third world countries, well outside the scrutiny of the FDA and involving a host of ingredients that are harmful. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that up to 30% of all drugs in developing countries are counterfeits. Our legislative work on this will close loopholes in the law, stiffen penalties for counterfeiters, and discourage this market from growing. On a brief, unrelated note, Mr. Chairman, my thanks to you for the work the committee has done and the outreach that Representatives Costello and Peters have done to me and my office related to their third-party servicing bill. I hope that this is an issue the committee will continue to include in the final user fee package. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your support of this important amendment that will protect the safety of the American people, and to Mr. Green as well, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the chair. Thanks the gentleman. Other discussion? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Request to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important for everybody, for our constituents to understand how serious this matter is. This matter, and I'd like to thank the authors for this measure, is in the tens of billions of dollars a year. This is not some haphazard, once-in-a-while issue. This affects Americans of every age, and unfortunately, what happens in certain communities where to save a couple of dollars, they end up going to a market where they end up getting something that on the surface looks like it's what they need, and they think they're getting what they need for their health, and in reality, what they're getting is something that could in fact harm them or even kill them. So the magnitude of this issue is tremendous, and I think that we need to continue with this measure and any measures to make sure that we close this horrendous act that actually, in the end, does in fact take people's lives. So I'd like to thank the authors.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, I'll yield.
I just want to underscore that. Some years ago, we had a series of hearings in the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee about the tremendous pressures that counterfeit drugs are putting on our entry sites into the U.S., and how when people are ordering these drugs, they have no idea. Now, it's not just counterfeit drugs, but it's also the way they're handled in transit and so many other issues. And we really do need to work very closely to get a grip on this. I think this amendment's a good first step. Thank the gentleman for yielding.
Gentleman yields back. Chair,
Yield back. Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentleman. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to strike the last word to speak about my bill, H.R. 2026, the Pharmaceutical Information Exchange Act of 2017. Earlier this year, the FDA released a draft guidance to enable greater post-approval communication of healthcare economic information between medical and product manufacturers and population health decision makers such as health plans and integrated delivery networks. The FDA guidance was 20 years in the making, and this committee passed a law in 1997 to create a safe harbor for this communication, but FDA never released guidance to the industry on how the agency would interpret the law. FDA's issuance of a draft guidance in January is a welcome step in the right direction, but it leaves several issues unresolved that warrant targeted clarifications in the statute. In my bill would enable greater information exchange in order to guide health plans, pharmacy benefit managers, and others who develop prescription drug formularies and help them make well-informed decisions about the benefits and costs of medications for the populations they cover. Patients benefit when these formulary decisions are informed by the most recent and reliable scientific evidence on drugs, beyond just what was learned from the clinical trials conducted for FDA approval. Our committee has addressed post-approval information exchange. We should take the next logical step by addressing what information can and should be exchanged pre-approval by considering H.R. 2026. That draft FDA guidance from January also includes a helpful first step towards creating a safe harbor for pre-approval communications and the sharing of information between manufacturers and payers. However, the draft guidance remains non-binding. If our experience with post-approval communications taught us anything, it's that we need both a law to establish the principle and guidance to interpret and clarify the details. Without a legislative safe harbor, corporations are going to avoid this area to ensure they don't violate the current prohibitions against pre-approval promotion of medical products. Pre-approval information exchange is important to manufacturers, payers, and integrated healthcare delivery networks because it will increase the utilization of value-based pharmaceutical payment models. It will also allow payers to forecast and budget more accurately for their pharmaceutical spend instead of being surprised by mid-year breakthrough drugs like the recent advances in hepatitis C treatment. I hope my colleagues will take a look at my bill, H.R. 2026, the Pharmaceutical Information Exchange Act of 2017, and I invite anyone who is interested in sitting down and working through outstanding questions or concerns they might have before the full committee markup. I'd also like to submit the record, a letter dated April 19th that was submitted to the FDA in response to their draft guidance document. The letter supports the approach taken in HR 2026. The letter was signed by a wide variety of organizations, including health systems, payers, PBMs, and pharmaceutical manufacturers. And I have the letter to submit.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I would like to yield to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden.
I thank the gentleman from Kentucky for his work on H.R. 2026, the Pharmaceutical Information Exchange Act. You know, last year in 21st Century Cures Act, our committee took important strides to ensure that better information sharing between the innovators who discover new treatments and the payers that provide access to patients. We think this is important. However, more work is needed to modernize the FDA regulations that needlessly restrict and hamper the sharing of clinical and health economic information. Decisions that payers make regarding coverage and formulary placement are critical in ensuring the right patient is getting the right drug for the right value. These decision makers have stated that waiting for FDA approval needlessly delays and blocks access to important clinical and economic data to inform their judgment. As noted by the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy, and I quote, access to this information is needed 12 to 18 months before FDA approval when organizations are deciding on terms of coverage and budgetary assumptions for state health insurance rates filings, Medicare and Medicaid bids, and contracts with healthcare purchasers and other financial arrangements, close quote. Federal law and regulations are not allowing this important exchange of information to occur. There's simply no good reason we should continue the status quo. Your bill, Mr. Guthrie, is a good step toward addressing this glaring problem. I believe it's something we need to move forward on. The broad array of managed care plans, health systems, biopharma innovators, economists, and academia backing your effort is a strong indication that you've put forward a good idea whose time has come. Our laws must be updated to ensure the right patient is getting the right treatment for the right value. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair thanks the gentleman. Are there other members seeking discussion of the amendment? For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Burgess. This is a good amendment, but I would like to take this time to discuss a collateral issue that you know well, both in your previous life as a practicing physician and in your current role as a legislator. The long overdue need for Congress to clarify how medical product manufacturers can responsibly engage in a meaningful dialogue about data and information that is not included in their product labeling. When FDA approves a drug or device, it is authorizing the manufacturer to market the product for certain uses or in specific manners that are included in the label. While manufacturers cannot promote or advertise their product for off-label uses, doctors prescribe and administer drugs and devices based on their medical expertise and information they have gathered from a variety of sources that are not limited to the FDA-approved labeling. Oftentimes, the information contained in the labeling is vastly different than the accepted uses of the product in clinical practice. We have heard time and time again that a large percentage of cancer, rare disease, and pediatric patients receive off-label treatments as the standard of care. In fact, estimates suggest that around 40% of overall prescribing decisions are off-label. Product manufacturers often have data and scientific findings that would inform physicians as they are determining the best course of treatment for their patients. However, not only has the FDA strictly prohibited companies from proactively disseminating such information with the threat of criminal penalties and multi-billion-dollar fines attached, the agency has recently made the case that the company's mere knowledge that one of their products is being used off-label could constitute evidence to be used against them in a court of law. Starting around 2011, the legal landscape began to dramatically shift. There have been a number of court decisions that raise significant First Amendment questions about the FDA's authority to restrict a drug or device manufacturer from communicating truthful and non-misleading off-label information about their products. Regardless of what one may think about the outcome of these decisions, the bottom line is that the judiciary branch has become the de facto policymakers due to our inaction. I would argue that federal judges and their clerks have a less nuanced understanding and appreciation for the FDA approval process than does this committee. Congress needs to step up to the plate and responsibly set the rules of the road before it is too late, which is why I introduced H.R. 1703, the Medical Product Communications Act. This is not a bill about television ads or snake oil salesmen. This is a good faith attempt to ensure that companies who often have the most accurate and up-to-date information about their products can provide doctors and researchers with that information and in the appropriate context to improve patient care and facilitate additional research. I have letters here from over a dozen rare disease patient advocacy groups as well as the Healthcare Leadership Council expressing strong support for H.R. 1703. I would like to insert those into the record.
Without objections, ordered.
I also have a letter that was sent to the FDA by the Arthritis Foundation, the Cancer Support Community, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, the Lupus Foundation of America, the Musella Foundation for Brain Tumor Research, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, the National Organization for Rare Diseases, and the Oncology Nursing Society. This letter states that quote, the current restrictions on communications of off-label information may be intended to protect patient safety, but in certain cases, it limits the ability of many patients to learn about, understand, and access vital treatments and therapies. There must be more flexibility and opportunities to proactively share clinical and research findings from diverse sources beyond the label. I agree. Again, I believe H.R. 1703 responsibly clarifies some key terms and concepts of the statute, interpretations and applications which have stifled constitutionally protected and medically valuable information from being shared. I am open to any and all suggestions from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle about how we can improve this legislation. However, doing nothing is no longer an option. And, Mr. Chairman, I would then yield to you.
Mr. Griffith, I feel you are correct. I've been following this issue closely for some time. In the past, I have offered solutions that some might say go a bit farther than H.R. 1703. This is a very thoughtful approach, and I certainly thank you for your leadership on there. Restricting accurate and up-to-date information from reaching healthcare providers is not only constitutionally suspect, but it is bad public health policy. And I would like to yield to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden.
Thank the gentleman, and I'd like to second Dr. Burgess's appreciation. This is something the committee should clarify legislatively. I'm open to any constructive feedback from all members to improve this bill and find bipartisan consensus. Simply put, federal law and regulation is not kept up with how medicine is being practiced today, and the courts should not be the ones deciding these matters for us. And so thank you for your work, and I yield back.
And gentleman, Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion of the amendment? If there's no further discussion.
I don't know if I'm supposed to strike the last word now or next.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oklahoma seek recognition?
I'd like to move to strike the last word, please.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk a little bit about a bill that is near and dear to my heart. It's called the Race for Children Act. An Oklahoma family very recently lost their 2-year-old son, Kai McAlpin. Earlier this year, Kai died of pediatric cancer. His family, his parents, who I've got to know very well, referred to Kai as Kai Warrior. Clinical trial research for children with cancer lags behind the adult cancer research for many years. So even though there are breakthroughs in cancer research and treatment for adults' cancer, children like Kai won't reap any of those benefits. The Race for Children Act would address the lack of access pediatric cancer research has in the novel and promising clinical trials that they have been proven to show in adults. I'd like to thank my colleague, Chairman McCall and Chairman Butterfield, for introducing the Race for Children Act. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this committee, and I want to continue to work to pass the Race for Children Act. Hopefully, life-saving cancer treatments can be made available to these children. I'd like to yield the rest some time to Chairman Butterfield, and then I'll take the time back.
Thank you to my friend Representative Mullen, and thank you for promoting me to chairman. I'm going to decline that.
I'm sorry about that.
But
just reading what was on my paper.
Yeah. But thank you for your advocacy on this issue, Mr. Mullen. It is very appropriate. 5 years ago, Mr. Chairman, as part of the last FDA user fee agreement, I put forward the Creating Hope Act Pediatric Priority Review Voucher Bill to address the scarcity of drug development for children with life-threatening illnesses. And so I'm proud to say that Congress passed the Creating Hope Act in 2012 as part of the last FDARA agreement. I'm also proud to report that last year, as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, Congress reauthorized the pediatric PRV program. The PRV program has transformed the development of drugs expressly for children by creating almost $1 billion in voucher sales. However, besides drugs developed expressly for children, there are also many drugs developed for adults that could benefit children. In fact, there are almost 900 drugs, Mr. Chairman, in the adult cancer pipeline. However, only a handful are in development for children with cancer. This is an opportunity. If the science is available to find better cures for adults, why can't we also apply these cures for children? In fact, there is a law, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, that requires companies developing adult drugs to also undertake studies of their drugs in children. Since Congress passed the bill in 2003, it has been very valuable. It's been a valuable program and has resulted in pediatric studies of 456 drugs. However, drugs for cancer, the #1 disease killer of children, are excused from PREA, pediatric studies, because of 2 loopholes. It's imperative that this committee and the House act to pass my bill that I introduced with Chairman Mike McCall, called the Research to Accelerate Cures and Equity for Children Act, the Race for Children Act, to close these loopholes and ensure that the protections of the Pediatric Research Equity Act are extended to children with cancer. I am sorry that we cannot adopt the Race for Children Act today, but there is more work to be done in developing specific and widely supported language for this critical act. And so I want you, Mr. Burgess and Mr. Pallone, if you will so kindly, that we work with our Senate colleagues and the committee staff and advocates in this regard. To that end, I ask you for a commitment, sir, to work with me, to work with Mr. Mullen and the bill sponsors as this process moves forward, so we can deliver results sooner rather than later for vulnerable populations who could benefit from life-saving treatments. I now yield the remainder of my time to my respected chairman, Mr. Burgess.
And the chair thanks you for yielding, and thanks Congressman Mullen and you for your work with Representative McCall on this important initiative. This subcommittee has a long and rich history of commitment to incentivizing and speeding medical innovation, and both Chairman Walden and I are dedicated to working with you on this legislation between now and the full committee markup. There is no cause more worthy than increasing the number of safe and effective treatments available to children battling cancer, and I assure you we are dedicated to advancing that policy and will do so. I yield back to Mr. Mullen, who I suspect is yielding back the balance of the time. Chair thanks the gentleman for yielding back the balance of the time. Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the issue that we're talking about right now, and I appreciate the good words that my friend that just spoke offered about both the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act and the Pediatric Research Equity Act, both the BPCA and PREA. I'm proud to be the author of both of those bills, and I'm especially proud, they were bipartisan, of course, I'm especially proud of how successful the programs have been in treating children, resulting in new dosing information, new indications of use, new safety information, and new data on effectiveness. These programs really recognize that children are not just small adults. They have unique medical needs, and drugs react differently in their very small bodies. Before both of these pieces of legislation became law, the vast majority of drugs, more than 80% used in children, were used off-label without data for their safety and efficacy. Today, that number has been reduced to 50%. So we're making progress, and I'm pleased that both of these programs were permanently reauthorized through the last user fee agreements in 2012. There's always room to make improvements in anything that we've done. I stand to work with those that are working to improve it. I think that as we move forward, we want to make sure that the FDA reauthorization moves through very smoothly. And I also understand that conversations about reforms are ongoing, and we're not ready for this subcommittee's markup, but I think that the user fee agreements, present an opportunity. So to Mr. Butterfield and to others, I stand ready to work with you, and I want to encourage all the stakeholders to do what's best to improve the quality and the quantity of life-saving pharmaceutical therapies that are available to children. And my commitment is there, and I think both of the laws speak for themselves in terms of having accomplished that. So I look forward to working with members of the committee, the staff, certainly the Senate on this issue, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair thanks the gentlelady. Is there further discussion of the amendment? If there is no further discussion, the vote occurs on the amendment. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there further amendments to the bill? For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 2430, offered by Mr. Schrader of Oregon.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Last year, a constituent of mine named Susan contacted my office in dismay. Cyprine, a drug she took for a rare disease, had risen in price from $600 a month to $22,000 a month over a very short period of time. Drug wasn't innovative, it wasn't new. In fact, it was off patent. It had first been approved by the FDA in 1985. So what changed? It wasn't the drug's formulation, the cost of ingredients, or even a shortage of supply. The only thing that changed was that Valiant, the manufacturer of this prescription drug, decided to raise the price and raise it again and again and again, before long leaving Susan, in her own words, hopeless. There was no generic competitor for this drug, and she couldn't continue to afford that life-saving medication. Unfortunately, this is not the first time we've heard a story like this. We all heard about Martin Shkreli at Turing, who raised the price of Daraprim, another critical life-saving drug for those with rare disease, by over 5,000% overnight. Overnight. Again, no generic competition for this drug. Nothing to force the price to come down. We've all known for a time now this is an area Congress needs to act to ensure these abuses would not continue. I decided last year to work across the aisle with my good friend Gus Bilrakis to combat this problem and work to encourage generic competition where there isn't any on the market. We know that when generic drugs compete in the market, drug prices come down dramatically. Although 9 out of 10 prescriptions are for generic medications, generic drugs make up only 28% of the total cost of prescription drug spending. Unfortunately, though, some drugs for small patient populations may not attract the same interest from generic drug manufacturers due to market and regulatory uncertainty. This amendment takes many steps to encourage competition and lower prices here today. First, the amendment requires greater communication between the FDA and manufacturers for these competitive generic products before and during the application process. We have seen great strides toward faster drug approvals in the brand drug breakthrough process, and this is modeled after that. The base bill also puts the application on the accelerated review process timeline, bringing it to market quicker and cutting into any anticipated exorbitant profit margins unscrupulous actors plan to reap and discouraging bad actors' behavior in the first place. The amendment also creates an incentive for this select set of particular generic drugs to come to market by guaranteeing them the same 6 months of exclusivity that the vast majority of first generic drugs currently receive. Under current law, generic drugs challenging a patented drug, they get this treatment. This would extend that treatment for new generic drugs competing with off-patent brand drugs where there is no competition. The amendment also closes a loophole and improves program integrity in the Tropical Disease Priority Review Voucher Program, more consistent with legislative intent, ensures greater transparency at the FDA, and studies what we can do about getting more first-cycle approvals in the Generic Drug Review Program. There's no doubt there's a lot more we can do to reduce drug prices going forward, and we've heard that here today. But this amendment takes great steps toward quickly bringing more generic competition to the market, which can bring prices down dramatically. Again, I'd like to thank my good friend, Mr. Bill Rockus, and the committee leadership for their work on this amendment. I urge my colleagues to support it. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. For purpose, does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
I ask to strike the last word, Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Appreciate it. I appreciate the committee taking up this amendment based on the bipartisan Lower Drug Costs Through Competition Act, which my good friend from Oregon and I introduced in the last Congress and again in January, and I appreciate you offering this amendment, Congressman Schrader, this morning. This amendment is a targeted approach to fixing some of the problems on the generic side at FDA and dealing with the issue of high prescription drug prices. We are dealing with the issue, Mr. Chairman. I know many of my constituents and folks around the country are deeply concerned about being able to afford the medicine they rely on. This amendment would directly address situations like Turing Pharmaceuticals hiking the price of an HIV drug from $13.50 to $750 overnight. That's unacceptable. Or when Mylan raised the cost of the EpiPen by more than 400%. Too often, bad actors like these in the marketplace take advantage of monopolies, skyrocketing the price of life-saving medications simply because there is little to no competition. We're going to fix that. The amendment creates the new Competitive Generic Therapies Program. This will provide drug sponsors better feedback before submitting an application and helps address the one major problem in FDA, which is their 9% first cycle review. Think about that. Only 9% of generic drug applications are approved on the first submission. If it takes 3 tries to get approved, 5 whole years could have gone by. That's 5 years of patients not getting a lower cost generic drug. The amendment also creates an exclusivity incentive for drug companies to develop a generic drug where there are no generic drugs available. This will help encourage competition and drive down costs. There are no shortage of potential for increased competition, Mr. Chairman. Americans continue to feel the pressure of rising drug costs, and we are addressing that issue with this amendment. We need to take thoughtful action to solve this issue affecting so many millions. I know everyone agrees with that. Leveraging the power of the free market and incentivizing competition among drug makers will drive down costs. I'm glad that the committee will take this amendment up and look forward to its adoption. I yield back. Thank you.
Will the gentleman yield?
Yes, I will. Absolutely.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'll just say generic drugs are an American success story and have saved probably $1.5 trillion for American consumers over the last 10 years. I want to thank Representative Schrader and Bilirakis for their leadership, for working so hard to advance this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support. I yield back to the gentleman from Florida, who then yields back the balance of time. Chair thanks the gentleman. Further discussion on the amendment.
Does the gentleman yield?
The gentleman would be happy to yield.
Okay, because I don't want my own 5 minutes on this. I want to thank both Congressman Bilirakis and Congressman Schrader for working with us on the bill, and I think it's a success. And and just appreciate this is how we're supposed to do legislation. And I'll yield back. Thank you.
And the gentleman from Florida yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. Further discussion on the amendment? If there's, for what purpose the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Seek recognition and strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to thank my colleagues Schrader and Bilirakis for for working on this issue. It's incredibly important. And at the same time, I'd like to thank the chairman and say how much I appreciate the bipartisan work that's going on this amendment and the bill that we're hearing today. But in addition to that, I'd like to bring up something that hopefully will be taken up soon, and that's and I want to first thank the outreach that Representatives Peters and Costello have done to provide me and my office with informing us on the issue of their third-party servicing bill, which is H.R. 2118, the Medical Devices Servicing and Accountability Act, which takes modest steps to ensure that the FDA has some insight into the servicing work on sensitive medical imaging equipment like MRIs, CTs, and radiation therapy equipment done by third-party servicers. As the FDA works to address third-party servicing, it's imperative that all party servicing medical devices are at a minimum registered with the FDA. The Costello-Peters bill is a practical solution that will protect patients who not only rely on the safety of medical devices, but also on their effectiveness and their reliability. I look forward to continuing to work with Congress members Costello and Peters and the committee as conversations continue so that this important issue can be added to the package of full committee at the full committee markup. And once again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity for us to take up these bills today.
Gentleman yield.
Sure.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Just want to be efficient here with the use of time. I want to also thank the authors of the amendment, Mr. Schrader and Bilirakis. Obviously, this is one of a number of things that we can do to try to address drug pricing in the United States. There are many things that I think we would like to have discussed in a full hearing on the issue. If you look at the polls out there, for many Americans, the number one concern they have is the high price of prescription drugs, drugs generally, and I think they're looking for solutions. There's concern about price gouging. I think that's a fair area of inquiry for our committee, and we ought to look into that. They're concerned about overall transparency when it comes to drug pricing in the industry. There's a lot of different players out there. It's hard sometimes to kind of follow the ball on drug pricing. We need to have some rigorous inquiry into that so we can translate the concerns that we're hearing when we're in our districts. Many of us have pushed for a long time to give the Medicare program the authority to negotiate on drug pricing with the pharmaceutical industry. We're barred from doing that. That means in the so-called free market capitalist society in which we operate, the 40 million Medicare beneficiaries are not allowed to go into the marketplace and get the best price by negotiating directly with the pharmaceutical industry. That needs discussion as well. So there are a lot of different things we can do to address the concern Americans have about high drug prices, and this amendment is one of those. But it invites us to think about all the other areas that we could be exploring that could help everyday Americans with the cost of something that for many of them is life-saving. It's the difference between having a decent quality of life and feeling under a tremendous pressure and burden. So I hope our committee will find its way that on a bipartisan basis we can arrive at the kind of inquiry into this that the public deserves. And with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sarbanes. On that note, with the few seconds I have with my time, I'd like to thank you for bringing that up. And we heard a lot about drug pricing, and perhaps that's one of the top issues that every American has on their mind, not only during the 2016 election cycle, but on their minds every single day, whether they have a child that they're caring for or a senior in their family that can't afford to keep up with the pricing of drugs that we have in America. So hopefully, Mr. Chairman, we can have a robust hearing on that issue in and of itself sooner than later. And I would venture to predict that there's probably not a member on this dais on both sides of the aisle that wouldn't welcome that opportunity. So with that, hopefully we can have that hearing soon. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Further discussion on the amendment. For what purposes, the gentlelady from Illinois seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to take this opportunity to expand on the comments I made in my opening statement and also to follow up on some of the things that my colleagues have said. It really is truly astonishing that the American public continues to call for action to lower drug prices, and yet this committee has not held a single hearing on drug prices. We didn't hold a hearing when Mylan raised the price of EpiPen from by 460%. That hearing happened in the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. We didn't hold a hearing when Martin Shkreli raised the price of a life-saving drug that had been on the market for decades by 5,000%. That hearing happened in the Senate Committee on Aging. Now Chairman Alexander has agreed to hold a hearing on drug prices in the Senate Health Committee, and the Republicans on this committee refuse to do the same. In addition to the 6 in 10 Americans who believe lowering drug prices should be a top priority for Congress, 77% of Americans believe the price of drugs is unreasonable. And nearly 25% of Americans have skipped a dose of their medications due to the cost. This is one of the biggest health care crises in our country, and yet this committee, House Republicans, are unwilling to even have a conversation about how to solve this crisis. And let me remind my Republican colleagues that what people are facing every day when they try to fill a prescription, over the last 15 years, the price of insulin has increased more than 200%. The price of Avizio, which helps to prevent a person from dying when they overdose on an opioid, increased from $690 to $4,500. From 2011 to 2016, the price of Humira increased 126%, and now a single pen injector of the drug is nearly $4,500. Most concerning, price increases account for 100% of the pharmaceutical industry's $8.7 billion growth in earnings in 2016. Democrats have put forth several ideas on how to reform our drug pricing system, and yet Republicans refuse to even hold a hearing on any of them. We should be looking for ways to make the pharmaceutical industry more transparent, especially in terms of how drug companies price their drugs when the drug comes to market, and why the price of drugs already on the market continue to rise. We should be looking for ways for Medicare to reduce its spending on prescription drugs by allowing Medicare to negotiate for the price of drugs or require rebates as Medicaid does. Recently, the Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney said he was looking into requiring rebates for drugs covered by Medicare. Good idea. We should be looking into allowing patients to re-import drugs from countries like Canada, reducing exclusivity for high-cost drugs like biologics, and ending anti-competitive pay-for-delay agreements. It is time for this Congress to do what the American people are asking of us and work together to find solutions to lower the price of prescription drugs. And in addition to the costs faced by consumers, the public sources of funding, Medicare, Medicaid, all of those are being driven to very high rates because of the cost of prescription drugs. That is the big driver behind health care cost increases. We could do something about that. I hope we do work together to do something about that, and I thank you. And unless someone wants about a minute, I yield back. Thank you, I yield back. Oh, okay. Yes, I'd be happy to yield.
I think you make a great point about the price of prescriptions and drugs, and I hope, like you do, that our committee will actually hold a hearing to discuss some solutions to the high cost of pharmaceuticals. And with that, thank you for yielding.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Further discussion of the amendment. If there is no further discussion, the vote will occur on the amendment. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. And the amendment is agreed to. The question now occurs on forwarding H.R. 2430 as amended to the full committee. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the bill is agreed to. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the legislation approved by the subcommittee today. So ordered. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.